So I want to talk about the body as rebirth and try to deal with all the issues that are involved in that. We know that the Buddha, or Shakyamuni, had teachers before he finally gave up on them and just went ahead and did it on his own. And this relates to what we're talking about in terms of rebirth, because what he was doing was seeking for a way to stop rebirth. That was really a strong intent on the part of Shakyamuni. As we read in the Sutta Nipata, he had come to a place of absolute end of his tolerance of rebirth. And so the body of rebirth that we see all around us, from the Buddhist perspective, is that I'm sorry to say to all of us, none of us have in the past been an arhat. That's just the way it is.
Okay. Yeah.
But the Buddha was. In other words, Shakyamuni was an arhat. He is so described in the text. And he did not go through the process of any further rebirth. So what we're talking about here is his life, which ended rebirth, so that we can understand that that also can happen, but that when it doesn't happen, then the Buddhists say rebirth occurs. So the Buddha goes to all these great yogins who are out there in the forest, and he goes to the best teachers that he can find, and he sits at their feet, and they teach him their method. So, for example, Alara Kalama said to him, if you come and sit with me, I'm going to teach you a meditation in which you will experience the unlimited, infinite space consciousness. You will have a consciousness of limitless space. So Shakyamuni did that. He sat through and did all of the training which was required of him. And then at the end of it, in essence, said, well, thank you very much. It hasn't accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. That is, I recognize that rebirth is still staring me in the face. So I have to go farther. So this experience that he had, this sphere of infinite consciousness, is something that the Buddhists say, of course you can achieve it in samadhi, but it is not liberation from rebirth. This is vijnana, which is infinite. Antya is limitation. There is no limitation to consciousness. And yet, even this extremely high state did not meet the requirement that Shakyamuni had, that was, I'm going to end rebirth, and this teacher can't help me do that. So therefore, he had to seek other teachers in this attempt to figure out how you could stop the body from reoccurring. So he sought another teacher, Uddaka. This was his second teacher. This teacher took him under his wing and he said, I'm going to teach you how to have an experience in which you have neither perception nor a lack of perception. So the Buddha, Shakyamuni, still at that time, not yet a Buddha, he did that. Those of you who look at Buddhist material will recognize that this idea was held onto by the Buddhist, and that in the stages of rebirth, the highest level in the arupa dhatu that you can be born is the state where you have neither perception nor a lack of perception. But it's still in the rebirth process. Even this very high state. So Shakyamuni had to say to Uddaka, thank you very much. It didn't work. I'm still heading for rebirth, and that's not what I want. So after that time, he left those teachers and he underwent the process of extreme asceticism, thinking, well, if I really torture myself, if I give up eating, if I just sit and struggle against all the body forces, I can reach some state. So he got down, we're told, to where he ate 1 grain of rice a day. And he was skin and bones. And then, as he was approaching death, which was what he was expecting, and remember that among the Jains, starvation or fasting to death was the greatest spiritual path for somebody, and still is. That is, if you really want to achieve the highest state, then you fast. You just don't even take anything, including water. So it's a very, very, in the Jains, very, very hard situation. So the Buddha was, or Shakyamuni was in many ways, following something which must have been current in society. People understood this. If you want to achieve a high state, then you just go into fasting. As he was approaching death from fasting, to his horror, I think, he realized, I'm going to be reborn. Even though he had taken himself to this extreme level, he had pushed his body as far as you can push it, and he had taken it to the place where he realized that he was dying, and yet here he is, still facing rebirth. So that's when, under the Bodhi tree, we're told, he sat down, and before he did it, however, he ate. A young girl is said to have brought him some, basically yogurt, and he ate it, and he bathed. And he gave up his ascetic practices that were taking him to death, And then he sat under the Bodhi tree and said, I'm going to sit here till I have the experience that assures me rebirth is over. We're told that in the middle of the last night that he was doing this, the place that he had gone to meditate was Gaya. Gaya in India is the place of death. That's where people try to go to be buried. So it's kind of a national cemetery, in a way. And the ashes of people, or their bodies and their bones, people bring them there if they possibly can to bury them. So it was like on that night, all of the spirits of all those people who had been brought there to be buried came to him. And he had the experience of seeing and having contact with thousands and millions of beings. And he was shown that all of them went through a process of birth, death, and rebirth. And he watched it happening. In other words, the very thing which he was so hoping to get away from, for a period of time on that night, he saw it in endless array of repeated patterns. He saw people being born and suffer and dying and being reborn and going through it over and over. And he had this incredible experience of his compassion for all of these people who had gone through this. And so his compassionate act was to say, I don't want to do this. I want to prove that you don't have to. So it is said that finally the enlightenment occurred at dawn, that he had nirvana with remainder. That is, he was still alive, he was still with his skandhas, but he had assurance at that moment, I'm not going to be reborn. I know now how to do it. Anytime I want, I can do this. I can go into this nirvana, and from nirvana, you are not reborn. So we see that the struggle for the founder of Buddhism in his own process of seeking for enlightenment was that he really wanted to be liberated, and he wanted to be liberated from rebirth, and he wanted, therefore, to be liberated from the body. And that he achieved. In the sense that when his final nirvana came, as I said before, it's like putting out a fire. There's no reason for continuation of the fire. There's no fuel. It doesn't go anywhere. It just goes out. There's no cause for it. So this was the struggle. Now, of course, we know in the Mahayana tradition that another stream of thought came in. And the stream of thought which came into Buddhism was the idea that there's something even greater than stopping rebirth. In a sense, they put this above what he did as an arhat and said the greatest power you can have is to choose your rebirth. If you have the power to choose your rebirth, then that is the greatest power. So that developed the Bodhisattva concept which dominated Mahayana, which was to say, I now have the power to be reborn as many times as I want, wherever I want, wherever I'm needed. I have control over it. So it's like a lot of things. If you can find this element of control, then somehow it's all right. It's very different than if you are tossed into a world where you're just unable to control and you're born in one lifetime after another with no control. You're just at the mercy of cause and conditions, and it just happens to you over and over. It's quite another if you have developed this skill which says, this time I'm going to be born over here. Next time I'll be born here. Having that power takes a lot of the sting out in one way. But it was also seen as enormous power, and so we had the development of Mahayana, which was really based in many ways around the idea of rebirth of the body. And it was that which distinguished it in lots of ways from the Arhat traditions of the past in Buddhism. So ever since then, there's been a big debate in Buddhism. It's still going on. Which one should you do? Should you go for the Arhat? Should you say, I'm absolutely going to stop this rebirth process. I'm not going to have another body. This is it. Finished. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to have the power to cause it to happen. It's like anything that we go through when we're trying to develop our skill in something. I can wish, if I'm a basketball player, that I could just throw the ball at the basket and it will go in every time. Some players seem to have that ability. But my thinking it and my wanting it doesn't necessarily mean I can have it. The discipline, the practice, the long hours of effort that are required to achieve this freedom. So that the Buddhists often say it's according, you want to reach a state where you can act according to your wish. What you want is what happens, because you have developed to that point. So that's a little bit like the rebirth when you can choose your rebirth. It means you have the power of wishing. Where I look, that's where I am. Where what I want, that's what happens. However, for most of us, we are still caught in rebirth. We are sitting here in our bodies. That is a sign to us that we are still being reborn. Now, I don't know how many of you feel that maybe you wanted this birth, that you had the power to choose it, and that this is what you wanted. Or whether you feel, I had no power over this at all. It was pure, whatever the circumstances were, that's what made me the way I am. I'm here, beyond my control. So the Tibetans show it as that if you're in the body, if you're in rebirth, it's like Mahakala. Time devours us. When you're born, time starts eating you alive. And Mahakala always succeeds. Mahakala will devour us all. So the Tibetans make many images of Mahakala. And what they're trying to do, though, is to transform Mahakala, the devourer, into a great spiritual help. In other words, time being devoured and being caught in this is the nature of things, and if we come to know the nature of things, then we have some control and power over it. Usually, when you go to a doctor may say to you, you have diabetes. You got to stop eating sugar. In other words, part of the prescription is merely awareness. This is what you have. You need to know what you have. You then need to know what you can do about it, but your awareness must come before you know what to do. So that in the Buddhist tradition, Mahakala is, the vision of this is to say, you must be aware that this is the way it is. This is what's happening. Mahakala is devouring us right this minute. So we must be aware of this in order to know if there is a prescription or if there's anything we need to do or how we should operate in terms of this insight. So then the Buddhists were really involved with this, and they came up on the night of his enlightenment. Shakyamuni had nirvana with remainder. The remainder were the skandhas. He still had his senses, his sensorium. He still had form and feelings and perception and impulses and consciousness. So the Buddha said, this is what we live with, and this is what constitutes ourself. What we think of as ourself is this body with all of its senses, with all of its activity, combined with consciousness. We become conscious of our body. We can see ourselves. We think about self. So this redefined death. The fact that Shakyamuni, on the night of his enlightenment, could have nirvana and still be with the skandhas, said as long as you have your consciousness with skandha, you're not dead. that is not death. When consciousness leaves the body, in the sense of when consciousness separates itself from the other four skandhas, then this is the definition of the death of the particular body that we're in. It's a kind of strange, in a way, an unexpected definition of death. You would think that death would be described as when the physical system simply stops. It just doesn't work anymore. But they were much more subtle about their ideas behind it. They said, when the consciousness leaves the other skandhas, then the other skandhas just disintegrate. So that, in one way, our bodies right now are still functioning and alive because we have vijnana. And our vijnana keeps us going. Our vijnana tells us what to do. Our vijnana is that part of the mental capacity of the brain to cause the body to still function. So when the Buddha reached his final nirvana, then he had already, it seems, understood that at that moment, the vijnana, when it's separated from the skandhas, would have nothing contained in it to cause it to continue. Bodies come and go. In the rebirth thing, the Buddha saw millions of bodies. So having another body is not a big deal. Oh yeah, I've been reborn 30,000 times. Fine. I've had 30,000 bodies. What's new? There's nothing great about it in Buddhism. Nothing great at all. In fact, it's often seen as negative. But how in the world do you stop this strange force which is called consciousness? In other words, what Shakyamuni was facing was his vijnana, if it escaped from this body, would just keep on going and would reattach itself, and another birth would come. So it wasn't, he did everything he could to his body. He brought it right to death, and then it came to him, whoops. Here I am. Oops. Speaking of whoops. Hope I didn't break it. Is this still going? Pardon?
We still hear you. Yeah.
No.
But I don't know if it's because of the microphone, because it's close to you.
Is it on? Yeah, now
Yes,
it's on.
it's definitely on now.
Sorry.
It's still working.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
It looks better now. It's actually true, I don't know what was on before.
It's a skill that I've developed.
Yeah.
Is that the right?
It must, I don't know. It is, gosh.
Yeah.
I don't have to do anything but whisper.
Hey, here we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you so much. Try not to do that. So here Shakyamuni he's faced with this fact that he knew that he could destroy his body, but that wouldn't stop rebirth, because his consciousness would just float away and keep on going through the cosmos, and a new one would come. So it wasn't enough to just have consciousness pulled apart from the skandhas. You had to actually figure out, what do I do with consciousness itself then? How can I get that thing to turn off, to stop? How can I remove all the fuel that keeps it going? It just keeps burning because it's got the cause to keep on going. So consciousness became a crucial issue for Buddhism. And in a way, consciousness is becoming a big issue for us today. We're trying as much as we can to figure out what in the world is consciousness. And scientists are working night and day trying to figure out what it is. They're trying to ask the first question, can it be measured? If you can't measure consciousness, then how can you research it? But if you measure it, what are you measuring? And consciousness is so complex. Every time you think you've got it under control, just like Shakyamuni found, there it is. It's got another life. It develops something else. It's got huge numbers of potential appearances, manifestations. So this was the great call for the Buddha in turn, or Shakya Buddha by then, having had nirvana with the remainder. He was called Buddha. The Buddha then had the question of that he had developed this ability to turn it off. Not necessarily to turn it off, but simply to remove from consciousness all the factors in it that keep it going. In other words, he had to take the fuel out of consciousness. So there was nothing to cause it to keep going.
Lost your picture. Oh, there it is.
Don't know. I don't think I did anything
No,
that time.
you didn't. It just sometimes it swaps out and it stays on the same one for a while.
So that's to just introduce to you this basic problem. Problematic for rebirth and the body was crucial to the Buddhist tradition. And the other question was, is the body conscious? Because without consciousness, whatever else it is just simply doesn't work. And without consciousness, it rots and decays right away. Well, there were many attempts to figure out how in the world this could happen, that Shakyamuni could get this place. Later, the Mahayanists would say, it's because we all have Buddha nature. He had Buddha nature. So consequently, the power to do this was with him. He had this ability. He just had to discover the ability and make use of it. Other people, earlier Buddhists, would never have said that everybody has Buddha nature at all times. They say your nature varies according to your development. Some people have the nature of an arhat. Some have the nature of a shravaka, a hearer, and others have the nature of a Buddha. So there are multiple natures in the world, which is another way of saying not everybody's ready for this. Not everybody is at this point in their growth and development ready to understand the reality of their own abilities. So the Buddhist concept was that somehow consciousness separated itself from the body. And when it separated itself from the body, then they developed the idea that, at least some of them did, that it went to another place, a bardo in Tibetan, an intermediate space, and waited to be reborn. But you have this sensation that this consciousness, which has now been separated from its old body, thirsts and longs for rebirth, looks for it, searches. And in some cases, like the Theravada tradition, this drive for rebirth is so powerful that it happens very next moment. After it separates from one body, it's already found another one. Doesn't even wait a second. The impulse is so great to be reborn. Other people said, no, it takes 7 days, it takes 49 days, it takes 100 days. There were a number of traditions, how long. But however long it was, the thirst of consciousness for rebirth was seen to be a powerful part of it. And that you have, as long as that thirst is in consciousness, it's going to find a way. It's going to be reborn. It's going to find another body. It's going to put it together somehow. So this says that the real issue for enlightenment was, in one sense, the body. The Buddha reaches enlightenment in his body. You have to be enlightened, they say, as human. Yes, please.
After Lancaster, in Mahayana, people believe that from 7 days to 49 days to reborn, but in Theravada they said that reborn right away. So are both Buddhist doctrines are from Buddha?
Well, of course, Buddhism has always been a tradition of many kinds of arguments. And it's been many streams of thought. And it's 2,500 years with millions of people. You're going to have a lot of ideas. They were struggling to try to understand this process. And some people said, we don't understand where consciousness could go. How could consciousness exist apart from some place, some process? And the others said, it does. it floats free. Its consciousnesses are floating around right beside us right now, looking for a body. And of course, a lot of people really had a great fear that spirits and ghosts are always out to find a body. And if you aren't careful, they'll move into yours. And if they do, you're going to fall sick and you're going to be in great trouble and you got to get it out. You got to say, no, go away. You have to be saved from this invasion. I think that is part of how this idea of consciousness floating around looking for a body, that it was partly how people conceived the dead. What is it after death? Is that consciousness, or that force, if we want to leave it without so much of a definition, that force is all around me, then how in the world do we control those forces? And how do we have it so that our own force doesn't turn into a hungry ghost? In China, the worst thing to be is a hungry ghost. Hungry ghosts are pathetic. They're terrible. It's horrible. And the pictures of them, particularly the Japanese pictures of hungry ghosts, huge stomachs and tiny little throats that not even a grain of rice can go down in. They can't be satisfied. It's a terrible thing to happen. But those, in one sense, are like these floating vijnanas trying to keep going. Trying to keep going. So, the Tibetans in their meditations, as a number of people who've experienced near-death experience have expressed it, it's like going into a blue tunnel. And you walk down that tunnel, and that tunnel leads you on to wherever the next step is. And so how do you stop that process of going down the tunnel, which is your consciousness moving on to another birth, if that's what you don't want? So the Mahayanas say, forget worrying about the vijnana. Let the vijnana be what it is. Just develop it to the place where you can choose where you're going to be reborn. And do it until there's no rebirth anywhere. Do it till every consciousness that's ever developed finally reaches its apex and dissipates. At the moment that consciousness itself disappears, all of this will be solved. We don't have to worry about it. So how can you bring about that all consciousness will just dissolve and no longer be a part of the world's systems? And these are the major issues which were faced by the people trying to understand death and rebirth. So when people say, well, I remember that I was a certain person in a former life, the Buddhists would never deny that. I mean, they say, yeah, sure. Your consciousness was still driven so that here it is again. And you might even remember 3 or 4 of these experiences, but here it is again. Here we are again. What do we do with it now? So the question for every practitioner in Buddhism to some degree is, what is it you think you want to do with your consciousness? What is it that you feel is the solution? Should we try to turn them off? Should we just say, I can't do anything about it anyway? And get tossed from one thing to another? Well, yes, please. Let's have some discussion.
We talk about consciousness, but I mean, if you don't have consciousness, you can walk right in front of a car, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, I mean, in Buddhist practice, is our goal to be unconscious?
I don't think so. That's a good point. The other word for consciousness is awareness. If you look at the definitions, in some ways, awareness is closer to it than this amorphous thing that we've come to use, which is consciousness. The awareness, which is the functioning of the process by which we think and act. So, it's not to kill ourselves, it's not to be unconscious. As one of the Buddhist texts said, hey, if all the practice is that you want to be unconscious, we can help you a lot. We'll just hit you on the head and you're going to be unconscious. So why meditate? Let me just hit you right now and you're going to be unconscious. Is that the goal which you want? But the problem is that unconsciousness will pass and you'll come back to consciousness. I can put you to sleep. I can give you a drug and put you to sleep, but you'll wake up. We keep waking up. And so in one sense, that's not the solution. And they never advocated this. It was always awareness and control. Yes?
You are going to part of my presentation.
I'm sorry.
Glad.
Or I'm glad. Maybe you can explain it better than I have.
And I just want to say, your question is a common question from a lot of conventional standpoint in terms of modern science. But if I could look at your question, there's two ways to look at it. Seeing the cloud coming to you, a lot of the modern way of thinking that does not recognize consciousness, what we see consciousness, they'll just say that's cognition, that is our brain, that is our perception from one of our skandhas. So I think it's almost like a two different world than what a lot of what Dr. Lancaster is saying. There's, I do believe, from all my research, I feel like there's sort of two groups of people, if I could group them, is that those of us who believe in consciousness, above beyond the material world, versus the material conventionalist point of view saying everything is matter, everything is particles, right? You know, there's the neurons, the cells, the brains to our conception. But there's more, but the consciousness side we can talk about.
No,
Oh, we need to watch cartoons.
it's not mine. I think I hear it's coming from.
Oh, that's so funny. So I think I just want to point out that there's a difference. Your brain might die, but your consciousness do not die, according to what I believe. So you could not see the cloud coming to you. You might not perceive things anymore in that sense, in the material sense. It doesn't mean your consciousness will eternally distinct or disappear. They're two separate things to me.
Okay.
I came in a little late, so I don't know if you heard this or anything, but, so with the consciousness, there's always been this debate about like rebirth in consciousness. So, for example, when Buddha was alive, there were only 100 million people on Earth, right? And now there are over 7 billion people on Earth. Where did 7 billion people get their consciousness when there was only 100 million people on Earth?
It's the math problem. It is that,
Yeah.
it's the math problem of rebirth.
Yeah, I guess that's, people have
Sure.
said that
Yeah.
it came from animals or some that were
Right.
elevated somehow, but I guess that's the question is, 7 billion people, even if you have all these lifetimes, I think even like 10,000 BC, there were only like, I think, 10 million people on Earth. So how do we?
Let's just think about like the insects, their population.
Sure.
That's because you assume that we all have a consciousness. My research, again, I do not believe we all have a consciousness. There is only one consciousness, and we're part of that consciousness stream. When people say there's a higher self, a higher power, I always believe it, and now I'm finding a lot of stuff to read about it. We made up that consciousness. That's why we're interconnected. That's why when people say, I understand it more. Every time I read something now, it's like, and that's why Dalai Lama said, even he said that, he said, you don't have a consciousness, we all have a part of the consciousness. We are part of the universe, and we are all part of the consciousness universe. That's why with every single thing we do makes a difference. And that's why karma makes a difference. That's why that adds to the choice. So you don't just like, okay, do whatever you like, and just what you want, and I'll just revert to be revert to something else. And I feel like that's sort of the order of the universe, and you follow the Buddhist philosophy. It's like, it's not like every single sentient being has a consciousness, but we all kind of add to it. Dalai Lama actually used the word subtle consciousness, and that kind of makes sense to me. That's one way to say it, but it's all part of it. I don't know if that makes sense. To me, that makes sense in terms of the number 8. So it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's one good answer.
Well, there, I did my presentation.
Of course, the other answer, which is sometimes given, is that the Buddhists believed in multiverses, so that they never felt they were limited just to the numbers in this earth. This is just part of a vast, and it's almost like still very close to what you're saying, which is that this consciousness which spreads out across all of these universes, in a sense, has no limit. It's another way of saying it.
So there possibility of reincarnation from alien life?
Oh, of course.
Why not?
I'm not making fun of that. I think that is a possible theory of why.
Yeah.
Where do we get?
I used to have a co-worker.
Yeah.
I'm an engineer and I work with a bunch of engineers, and he goes to these monthly alien meetings and like that.
Oh, yes.
And one time he was saying, hey, Pete, actually, I'm actually a Martian. And I keep on, at that time I didn't really connect with what he's saying, but he was saying that, well, if you think about it, how Earth is formed, all these particles from space hit Earth, and eventually, so my life force has some of the Martian life force, whatever that hit the Earth billions of years ago, that accumulated. So, back then I laughed at it. But right now, if I think about it, maybe really
I think that we better take a break. I love the conversation and I don't want it to stop, but I think I need to ask the technicians to disconnect us from some other machine is playing this and it's being piped through our... I don't think it's magic. but it might be.
One of those ghosts swirling around.
It might be. So let's have a 50-minute break and we'll come back and let me see if I can. Preta, a ghost. And that ghost had to be ritually moved up to the realm of the fathers, taken to heaven, is basically what it means. Very shamanic, I think, in many ways. And we know that they had the idea that the Atman that had gone up to the fathers would fall back to earth as rain, become part of the food chain, and in that way the physical karma and body would continue. That form of rebirth theory was present at the time. So again, there was an aspect to this which was that it was not under control. Ritually, all you could do was to take your loved one up to the realm of the fathers, into the heaven. But you couldn't keep them there. Even though you did that, they weren't that far up because the rain would wash them back down to earth. And so it was a kind of nature idea of how renewal takes place. Yes,
I'm sorry, because then I can't help myself.
please. Don't.
So, was there discussion around the raindrops that fell and didn't become someone's semen? Sorry. I only asked because you already used me.
I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry to say.
No, it's okay, because it probably isn't really, maybe it's not addressed. I don't know, but,
Yeah.
like, what if it...
I think that they probably did have the idea that not every raindrop was
They had to have, right?
significant.
So maybe if it was my Atman, it would just evaporate, go back up and start over again. Or, like, what if it was eaten by a woman?
Yeah,
You know,
all of those were issues, I'm sure. This was a very male-dominated. These were basically males who go to the realm of the fathers, who have semen. I mean,
Right.
it was certainly male-dominated.
I probably would have been cast out for saying anything that I just said anyways.
Yeah, probably.
How'd I go?
So, what we would, the basic thing is just to say that in some sense, this was present there and somehow was in people's thoughts. That even though somebody's spirit was taken even to heaven, it falls back and gets reincorporated into the normal birth pattern. There's no way to sort of the idea that nothing can be lost. You can't remove anything because it just, nature just recycles it. It's a recycle theory. Your question's good. Sorry, I don't have an answer.
That's okay.
So, the basic idea which surrounded the Buddha was that rebirth is cyclical and that this cycle is just continuous. And that's nature. Nature has a continuous cycle. Seed, plant, blossom, seed, plant, blossom. It just keeps a constant cyclical repetition. And so we find, as I said in the Sutta Nipata, the Buddha is saying, I can't stand it. This cycle is just too much. I want out. How do I get out of here? How do I break free from this? Because it's suffering. I always kind of think to myself, it's like having to be a teenager over and over and over with all the angst of being a teenager. So this cyclical concept is also like a prison. That is, once you're in it, how do you break free of it? And Shakyamuni was doing some extraordinarily difficult things trying to break free of this. But it was so difficult, in their view, to break free of it. So in one way, when Mahayana with the Bodhisattva concept came in to say you're reborn as a Bodhisattva and have the power to choose, they were really going back to a more ancient Indian concept. That was not such a new idea. The Jains also had the idea that the most powerful thing you could do was to be able to choose your rebirth. That was, so I remember my colleague at Berkeley for many years was P.S. Jaini, who was a Jain, and when people would ask him about Indian ideas of spirituality, he always said from his experience, he had never met an Indian who wanted to go to nirvana. They all wanted to be reborn in a good family with a lot of money. And that was always his answer. Said, I never met anybody who wanted nirvana. They were all very busy trying to figure out how much merit do I need to get this kind of rebirth. In any case, rebirth and this repeating cycle is something which dominated the idea of the body. That the body reemerges and it keeps coming back. And so even though there's death and even though consciousness separates itself from it, there is always the reemergence, not only of consciousness, but of the body. The body keeps on. And that's a very powerful tradition throughout world religions. After all, in Christianity, the main issue in Christianity is bodily resurrection. That is, that the physical body itself gets resuscitated at the end of time and returns and is judged and either goes to heaven or to hell. So that kind of concept of the return is very great. A lot of people attribute it to the Egyptians, that the Egyptians had a very powerful religious tradition about Isis, that Isis was like nature, every year renewed. You could kill off everything, but the next year when it rains, it all comes back again. So we have that here in California. While I was on this long trip, it rained up our way. And when I came back, all the weeds were there again. It was renewal. They were growing up in the path once again. That's part of what people lived with, was the idea that everything dies down and then the rain comes and it comes back So no wonder they had the idea that whatever was up there in the sky, it came down with the rain. The rain brought the seeds almost back to this renewal. So as we were discussing, one of the big questions always was, how long does that process take till you get back? And the Theravada of today share that with the ancient Sautrantika tradition, that it's immediate, but that's also the Jain tradition. I really feel, and I wish that more work was done on it. Any of you who would ever like to do some of it, I think you would find it very good. That is, I believe that many Buddhist terms have to be seen in terms of what was going on with the Jains. The Jain belief patterns are powerful undercurrent in Indian life, and particularly at that time. And so the Buddhists and the Jains were basically in competition with each other, but yet they shared so much that in one way, I think what we need is a dictionary of Jain definitions of every single Buddhist word, because the vocabulary is shared by both traditions, and they define things slightly different. But when you look at it, it's like how long to rebirth. The Jains say it's immediate. So I can say that for the Buddhists to say that rebirth is immediate was an indication that this was present in the Indian life, that there were many people who felt this. So this immediacy of rebirth was one which was actually quite different than the Brahmanic one, about waiting 12 days and going up to the sky and falling back as rain and being renewed, and that takes time. So I think that the Sautrantikas and the Jains and the Theravadas and the other Buddhists were, in a sense, trying to get away from the Brahmanic tradition of this long wait and this long process through which the renewal took place. And they just wanted it to say, hey, it's immediate, like that. And so, for a lot of the Buddhists, later on, they became more Brahmanic. And lo and behold, it doesn't happen right away. It does take a process. It is 7 days or 49, or whatever days they want. And so you get two great streams in Buddhism, and you get two great streams in Indian culture. So when I look at the Buddhist ideas about the body and about rebirth, I just feel that I need to understand the cultural context in which they existed. And that you don't get too far away ever, I think, from the shared perceptions which are around you in a culture. They will make their way into any religious tradition, and they're going to show up in some form. So the length of time for the idea of the consciousness going into an intermediate region and waiting there before it comes back is very Brahmanic in many ways. It's closer to the Brahmanic idea than it was to the Jain and I think probably early Buddhist tradition of the immediacy of. Now, there's a problem with immediacy. That is, it's not natural. In other words, it removes you from the normal process of nature, which dies down, rain comes, and it comes back. That idea of Isis in Egypt, the renewal, is wiped out by this idea that rebirth is immediate. And nobody has really, I think, ever tried to come to grips with that as to what caused and what brought about that concept. So what is immediate rebirth really all about? It had some very powerful forces in the Indian